Hi, everybody. Welcome. We're just going to give a minute or two for more participants to join us, and then we'll begin. Put the recording on, please. Thanks.
Awesome. So thanks everyone for joining us. We are really happy to host you today. And our focus for today is to truly celebrate the spirit of giving in Africa and reflect on the rich landscape of Africa philanthropy. This is a subject that is truly significant to us, not just Giving Tuesday as a movement, but to us as a sector. So later on, our wonderful panel led by Halima will guide us on reflecting on what are the existing philanthropic practices across the continent? What do they mean? What are the significance of this then and now? And what is the future of these cultures and practice? What is the significance of these cultures and practice in the future of philanthropy? And one of the things that we are really keen to do is ensure that this conversation does help us reflect and think about what are the implications of some of these practices, some of these reflections in how philanthropy policies and practices are being shaped, not just at the continental level, but also globally. So a quick background of this project. 6 months ago, TrustAfrica and Giving Tuesday came together with one shared vision. And one of that vision was, how do we commit more and spend more time to reflect on our giving practices, to understand their depth, their diversity, especially the lesser known giving practices across the continent. And core to this shared value with TrustAfrica, and one that is also shared across partners in Africa, is to reflect more on the role of this in fostering elements of value that we've seen across the continent, including solidarity and community resilience. And from this, there's always a first step. We realize the significance and importance and the magnitude of this vision. And our first step was to work on a collaborative pilot project. So one of the things we did is partnered and connected with thought leaders across the continent, across 18 countries in Africa. And a result of this was 20 articles reflecting and describing on giving practices across the continent. So this conversation is truly a starter and is also part of a global process that is happening. This is part of the World Giving Library project, which is led by Giving Tuesday, the Giving Tuesday Data Commons, and the World Giving Library project really seeks to capture and share giving practices from around the world. And it's of importance and essence that as a continent, the content and those reflections at the global level truly reflect the depth and diversity of giving. So big shout out to Giving Tuesday team, especially Matt and the team, who've worked very closely with TrustAfrica and ourselves to profile and contribute to some of these articles. So my colleagues will share a link on this. So it offers you an opportunity to reflect and see some of the articles in there with so much richness and so much interconnection across how we give in Africa. So throughout this webinar, as I mentioned, Halima will be introducing a panel of discussants who will explore some of these narratives. One, they will let us into their world of their giving practices, their significance, and how these continue to influence philanthropy in their space. And one of the things that we're really keen to do is ensure that you all participate. So feel free to use the chat box and engage us. Also take this moment to reflect on some of these practices. If you would like to share some of the philanthropic practices in your space, in your community, please feel free to share that with us. So before I hand it over to Halima, I really want to give Ibrima, the lead of Trust Africa and our partner for this work, an opportunity to share more about Trust Africa and the value this work has in what they seek to do as an institution.
Thank you very much, Catherine, and hello everyone. Many greetings from Dakar in Senegal, where I'm speaking to you from. I'd like to begin by thanking GivingTuesday for, first of all, for initiating this project. Right? I think World Giving Library is an excellent initiative, but also thank you for reaching out to Trust Africa and giving us a chance to, to collaborate with you in making it happen. Also thank the panelists, the moderator Halima. Special greetings to Kumba. I see she's my boss, my board chair. But also Tendai, who's my immediate, predecessor at Trust Africa, and all the people who contributed to the project, who wrote the stories. Actually, they need to be celebrated, and everyone who has taken time to be with us today. Trust Africa is a Pan-African foundation that takes really keen interest in African philanthropy. It's one of our key pillars. We are a philanthropic institution of sorts. At the same time, too, we take keen interest in philanthropy as it is evolving globally, but also especially on the continent. On research on philanthropy in Africa, major publications coming out of it. Some by Halima, as you've seen, who is a fellow, senior fellow. Come up with great pieces that I think could be easily referenced and should be read by everyone. But also books and many other things that have been produced. Because it's important to keep track of, first of all, to deepen our knowledge of philanthropy on the continent, but also to keep track of what is happening. The field is evolving. It's becoming much more complex. It's becoming, really very strong. And a lot is happening here. But this project in particular for us, it's a great opportunity for doing many things. First of all, to continue the work that we are doing in terms of deepening the understanding of philanthropic practices on the continent through research and sharing, but also, understanding philanthropy globally and what dynamics are, and because I think, in some sense, the World Giving Library is one way of addressing some of the structural imbalances that characterize global philanthropy. Okay, global philanthropy is dominated by northern philanthropy, if I may put it that way. It is centered in the north, mainly, who are driving and building huge influence on everything that's happening, on the flows of resources, on the institutional forms, but also on the narratives about philanthropy globally. And so deepening our understanding of giving practices and the philosophies underpinning them is a condition for bringing out the truly universal nature of solidarity, of giving, and of philanthropy, and for making the global philanthropy community truly global, if I may put it that way. Leopold Senghor, because I'm speaking from Senegal, I'll quote that example. Senghor was the first president of Senegal. And talking about universalism, he used to be saying that, for fun of saying that universalism is actually a rendezvous of giving and receiving. Right? It's a rendezvous of giving and receiving. You give and you receive. If universalism is only a one-way movement of whatever it is, then it is not true universalism. It's not genuine universalism. So here too, I think contributing knowledge from practices of philanthropy in Africa and elsewhere and from all over the world helps in nuancing the understanding of philanthropy, making it much deeper, much richer, and getting us to get another, understanding of what, if it is about the love of humanity, how different forms that it is, and that's really a shared value all over the world. It is about donating private resources or time or talent or whatever we have for the public good. It's also something one finds. So how it's playing out in different parts of the world is important. I think it's also, we're just seeing from the studies that have been carried out in Africa with Trust Africa. Again, an opportunity to salute those who have been leading at Halima and Ogo on our side. The traditions are very diverse and they are very rich, as we have seen, but the commonalities are also very striking. You know, just two examples. If you take the case of this story on Malawi, for example, our livestock rearing and how somebody would ask a person to, you know, to look after their cattle, or it could be goats, it could be something else, and then get their own hut built up along the way by getting some, you know, a retribution in terms of in kind, you know. We have it in our, I mean, the Fulani of West Africa, the Polo or the Tukulor or whatever you call them in West Africa, we do it. When I grew up seeing that, you know, if you confide your cows to somebody, the first born from the cow and the second one will go to the owner, but the third one will be automatically, you know, owned by the person who is taking care of them. So you have a chance to build your own little herd as you go along. So I think this is very common also. A second example is if you take Takaful, and study about Takaful, you know, we are a Muslim society in the Senegal, I mean, in dominant Muslim majority societies in Mauritania, Senegal, Gambia, you know, part of Nigeria. Yeah, and so this is something we know. It's also these are practices that we are seeing. And so many of the practices of giving exist in a broad range of geographies and cultures, and the philosophies are also quite similar. We tend to share what we have, and we do so when and as the need arises. It's also important to note that various ways, the various ways in which people are encouraged to give, right? Giving is encouraged from everyone according to their capacity and their abilities, what they have. One saying in Fulani and in Wolof, in many of the West African languages, is to say that the hand on top is better than the hand underneath, you know. So better have your hand on top rather than having it underneath, which means better be the giver rather than the one receiving, right? And so it's an encouragement to give. It's an encouragement to donate. And the hand here is a metaphor for the relationship and for what? Be the one contributing, be the one going out and sharing what you have, rather than be the one always at the receiving end. And so I think this is really, really important. And talking about, therefore, African philanthropy, we know that it's at the forefront of giving on the continent in times of crisis, but also unusual. Actually, what happens is in times of crisis, some of the actors from outside may tend to walk away when things get really, really critical. We talk about Ebola or even COVID at the beginning. And then you see African diaspora and Africans, the communities around stepping in, you know, in a big way. One thing I want to say before I conclude is that I think the institutional types and forms are also evolving enormously. The ecosystem on the continent is changing very rapidly. The philanthropic ecosystem is changing. But the interesting thing is that the foundation type, you know, the institutional type, the foundation that came to us through the encounter with the West, you know, is actually beginning to be universalized. It's been adopted, including by religious philanthropy, you know, and by community philanthropy. They build foundations, family foundations, community foundations. Part of the reason and part of the explanation is the fact that the legal frameworks in place established by the state straitjacket you into particular forms. You know, you don't have a lot of options. So maybe there's some imagination to do at that level for the legal forms to follow existing practices and philosophies. But what is happening right now is we are you know, pushed to fit into the categories that exist, and the foundation category works in a number of instances, but maybe you can make it better if some effort was devoted. And probably this will come from research like one we are carrying out. If it turns out that there's a demonstration of the fact that the plethora of practices and the potential is so huge that real effort should be made by our jurists and by people who are in charge of that particular part of the issue to think about forms that would enable more than they would constrain these given practices and the philosophies. So I would just say that the World Giving Library is a great and a very timely initiative. Knowledge building about giving in Africa and depending on our understanding of it is something that is very, very central to all the work that TrustAfrica is doing. And it is really on top of some of the, in fact, greatest initiatives we've launched recently, what we used to call Reimagining Pan-African and Feminist Philanthropy Urgent Action Fund, that we now call Harambe Ubuntu. Pan-African and Feminist Philanthropies actually takes the whole issue of narratives very serious and more seriously. So once again, Thank you so much. Thanks to everyone for your time, for taking the time to be with us. Thanks to Giving Tuesday. Thanks to the panelists, to the moderator, and those who are leading the project. And it's really with great pleasure that we are part of this initiative.
Thank you, Catherine and Ebrima. And thank you to everyone who's joined us. We're seeing many people still coming in. So welcome to everybody again. I'll ask Bidemi one more time, and maybe later on in the session as well, to just repost the link to the website that has our collation of articles. But we're so glad you all could be here today. I want to echo Ebrima's thanks on behalf of Giving Tuesday and Trust Africa to really express our sincere appreciation to all of the authors who have contributed articles to this initiative. Your insights and reflections have been tremendous in advancing our understandings of African giving. And it's really so exciting to be able to see documented what we know is lived experience, what many of us know intuitively in our own context, in our own spaces, which we discuss and take for granted, to see these narratives and practices and traditions being reflected in a collation of articles is really important. We also, I want to also echo the thanks to the Giving Tuesday and Trust Africa teams, Catherine, Matt, Bidemi, Eme, Ogo, for all of the behind the scenes work that's been taking place. We want to recognize the important work also on African giving that is taking place in the sector. And this initiative is one part of that effort. So while this isn't a new topic, it is an attempt at providing a relatable, everyday reflection on narratives, traditions, and practices, which I said we know intuitively, but we don't see reflected, or we see reflected quite academically. The second thing I want to say is that there's really no hierarchy of practice. Diversity and plurality are critical components of African giving narratives. We tend to just label everything Ubuntu, and that's the easy way out. But we really want to be able to recognize both the connections within and between, but also the variations. From Kuvuwula in Malawi, which is a time-bound lending of livestock in which the recipient keeps the offspring and returns the original livestock, a variation of something Ebrima was talking about earlier. Tukaful in North Africa, which reflects the practice of solidarity and mutuality in society. Ukuwenena in South Africa, which reflects an action of non-reciprocal support in times of crisis. Idanen in Monaco, which was born in part as an effort to maintain peace between tribes. Hadia in Senegal, a religiously inspired gift through the Murid Brotherhood towards social benefit. These are just some of the examples of the articles that we're reflecting in this collection. And they are just the tip of the iceberg. We think that there's so much more to reflect, so much more that we don't talk about, so much more that's almost invisible externally. Lastly, and I think it's important to say this, that every society must contend with issues of power, of patriarchy, of contradiction. We are celebratory here deliberately, and we seek to profile the essence of African giving because it's marginalized, because it doesn't form part of the dominant narrative, and because we think it deserves recognition both for the act and for the meaning. But we're also cognizant of the dangers of romanticization, and the importance of problematizing the contradictions accompanies us in our analysis as we seek to engage further. Lastly, as we continue the conversation, please hold your questions for the open discussion, or feel free to type them into the chat as we go along. So on to the exciting part. I'm joined today by 4 panelists, each of whom has significant experience on different elements of philanthropy. Kumbature, Marwal Daly, Chris Worman, and Tendai Murisa. Welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for being here with us today and for sharing your insights and reflections with us. I'd like to ask each of you to begin by introducing yourselves, telling us a bit about your work in relation to philanthropy, and also responding to the question, why is it so important that we define and highlight African narratives of giving? Kumba, shall I start with you?
That's fine. Thank you so much, Halima. And first of all, thank you to all of the people who have been joining us. Wow, I see 120. Thank you for being here. My name is Kumbature, and I am the chair of the board for Trust Africa. I am a writer of children's books and a storyteller, also a feminist activist. And yes, for me, it's extremely important to highlight African narratives of giving for several reasons. And I guess the first one is that there is a narrative that we are struggling with, which is Africa and African being recipient, being beggars, and being the one always having to ask for support anywhere else. And that narrative is there because there is an erasure or an invisibilization, this is a word, of what Africans are given in terms of not only money, resources, time, expertise, etc. It's not visible, and it's important to show that. The second thing is about just the reason why we have to bring that narrative out. It's just what you were saying, Halima and Ibrahim talked about it, is that there are models that we could get inspiration from, ancient models, but also new models. Nothing is stuck in any places. There is a creativity about giving that is right here, that exists, and it is important to have them as part of the global narrative. So I think about narrative, this is one part that in philanthropy, as in everything else, there is a need to bring Africa in the picture in a different way than it has been so far. So thank you so much for this opportunity, and I'm happy to interact and hear more from all the people who are participating around their experiences, their ideas of giving. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kumba. Chris, can I pass it over to you?
Absolutely. Thank you. And my name is Chris Worman. I am the Chief Global Partnership and Strategy Officer at GivingTuesday. And I've been working in community philanthropy, community organizing, using community philanthropy as a way to work on community organizing and sort of the technology and infrastructure for community philanthropy and organizing intersection for about 20 years. And, to this question about why is it so important, I think for all of the reasons Kumba mentioned, I very much second. The two that I might add to that would be that sort of in this moment of global dialogue about the decolonization of philanthropy, the localization of philanthropy, it's critical that we have this sort of insight into the cultures and traditions that exist so that the decolonization narrative isn't driven by a group of well-meaning people who don't know what these traditions are, who don't understand necessarily, as Ebrima was saying, they don't have the perspective. That's not their fault, it's a fact. And so this can help have a richer, more nuanced conversation. The second thing I would add is I think it is critical at this moment, as we live at the intersection of the cultures and the futures of philanthropy, as people go online, as younger generations take the reins of leadership and narrative from us, they are being equally influenced, if not more so, by what they see on TikTok around them. And if we want to have a dialogue about how our cultures evolve in a way that is respectful of where we have been, then we must do this kind of work. We must do this work to talk about, celebrate, and reflect on where we have been as we start being a part of a very different media environment. So again, very much seconding everything Kumba said and maybe adding a couple. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Chris. I'm always mindful that when people ask me about the decolonization of African philanthropy, my instinctive gut reaction is, well, our organic philanthropy was never colonized to begin with. Let's be specific around what we're talking about. But we'll come back to that in a little bit later. Marwa, can I go over to you? You're still on mute, Marwa. No, your sound has disappeared altogether for some reason.
Like I'm not on mute.
You're fine now. Go ahead, Marwa.
Okay. My name is Marwa Abdali. I come from Egypt. Actually, I consider myself academic. I'm practitioner of development. I've been working all my life in community development work. And at the same time, I'm an academic because I teach also at the American University in Cairo, philanthropy, nonprofit management, innovation, and nonprofit management and social entrepreneurship. I believe I dedicated my life, Halima, and many of you guys, I dedicated my own life believing in the power of philanthropy and in transforming this world to make it a much better world. And this brings me to the idea why the narrative is important, because this is exactly was the reason why I dedicated my life.
Marwa, your sound is just very faint. I don't know if you can lean in closer or do whatever it is you were doing earlier to try and have this a little bit.
A little bit better.
Yes, thank you.
I'm trying to speak up. Let me know if this goes away again. No, I was just bringing the subject up why I believe the narrative of philanthropy is important was exactly the reason that made me dedicate all my life for the studying of philanthropy and belief and the implementation of local philanthropy and the power of community philanthropy in transforming society. And actually, when I was a student, like I wasn't born teaching at AUC. I was once a student of the American University in Cairo, and I was wondering what can we do to have like models of sustainable development in Egypt, and because we were a country that was relying on international aid for development work, and I was told by my professor then. You are not philanthropic in Egypt. There is no documents about your philanthropy in Egypt. You don't, people of AUC, they don't give back like people of other countries. So I told him, but AUC is a private university and it's so rich, so this cannot be a measure. He said, no, but you don't have any references. You don't have references. And at that point, I had the choice. Either I simply look like my professor told me at Rockefeller, Kellogg's Foundation, and Ford, and all these as my reference, or wonder how come a country of 5,000 years of documented civilization does not have philanthropy. And this brought me to the research on philanthropy and mobilizing resources to make a representation of philanthropy. And I think from this journey that is almost 16 or over 16, 20 years now is like, we have now a representative sample of philanthropy in Egypt, because I embarked on this research on philanthropy with a representative sample so that other students can speak about their existing philanthropy and claim it. And this led me to start a community foundation and name it after Waqfiyya, which is our oldest tradition of sustainable philanthropy. And then Waqfiyya became bigger. It's like the Waqfiyya of Egypt. I'm so flattered that I was part of changing the constitution, adding an article in the Egyptian constitution, Article 90, that actually obliges the government to invest in modernizing and innovating works and protecting it and guaranteeing its independence. And this is exactly the difference when you look inward for your strengths so that you can enhance it and make it better and make it innovative instead of only importing models, especially when in Africa, and we are so rich in philanthropy, and on these models we exported it to the whole world. So the narrative for me is key, is the essence that we need to start with.
Thank you so much, Marwa. Tendai, over to you.
Okay, thank you so much. I hope you can hear me. All right. You know, I was sitting and listening to colleagues. I couldn't help but recognize that Ebrima is looking so tired. Ebrima, what's going on in that office? I know what the pressures of that office, I sort of understand. But I know it's good to reconnect with colleagues, with Ebrima, with Kumba, and the whole team from TrustAfrica. And thanks again for the invitation. I think my name is Tendai Murisa. I'm with CVO Institute, for those who don't know me. And I've been, I work on the edges of practice and academia. I can never fully call myself an academic, nor can I fully call myself a practitioner. I get the opportunity or the privilege to dabble in both worlds. And I don't think I do it well, but at least I find myself benefiting from sort of those worlds, which at times the threat is they can be silos. The reason why I'm saying this, Halima, is because I think even for ourselves as a community of philanthropy, academics and practitioners, I think there's a time where we need to say, for how long should we keep on coming here to remind people of African philanthropy? Because we've been doing this for more than a decade now. Many meetings, we've been telling people how Africans do give, how our giving is actually pre-colonial. It is not necessarily influenced by the Western traditions or Western religions of Islam or Christianity, but even prior to those finding themselves on our shores, we're already engaged in different forms of giving. And our giving has always been values-driven. Yeah, that's why you have these interesting frameworks, Ubuntu, etc. So I think I think on the one hand, maybe we're not packaging it well, to an extent that we find ourselves still coming back to a place whereby we have to describe it again. Because if you go to colleagues at CAPSI, I think they have a project around this as well and other centers. So I think what we need to do now is to begin to say, how do we find a platform, an outlet to make sure that these practices of giving that are inherently indigenous are known globally and accepted? Like Maro has said, we have been influencing not only African giving, but even new modern forms of giving. They are benefiting a lot from us. So we see a lot of fascination with this crowdfunding, crowdsourcing. That's what we've been doing as Africans for years. We've been pulling together small parcels of money to make sure that children go to school, to make sure that we can bury each other, to make sure that we can have weddings, etc. So I think it's also maybe the challenge to the academic community and those of us in practice to say, how do we make connections with what is happening globally and how it is rooted in African practices? Because Africa continues to give, not only in terms of resources, but also in terms of feeding frameworks of sustainable forms of giving. And that is actually our biggest contribution, to say that we have a huge influence in the current modes of giving, even the high net worth types. Because when we talk about the first big givers, we'll be talking about those who are giving in West Africa, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we've had this rich tradition, but maybe our challenge for this project and many others is to say, how do we make sure that the world gets to understand and the world gets to appreciate the contribution of Africa, not only in terms of resources, because that also in its own, Africa is, for those who've been tracking it, Africa gives more than it receives in terms of aid. So, but in terms of us influencing cultures and forms and narratives in frameworks of giving, Africa has already been playing this part. So for now, and yeah, then we can come back to the next round.
Thank you so much, Tendai. Such a wealth of things to think about from all of you in terms of narratives. Kumba, I want to unpack this a little bit more with you. We're talking of African giving narratives, practices, traditions, but we're not talking about them in a vacuum. At its core, we're looking at giving rooted in notions of solidarity, of reciprocity, of collective identity, of collective humanity. So giving is an act, but it's not just transactional. It holds meaning in and of itself. Can you talk a little bit more about this?
Thank you so much, Halima. I can give just some example maybe, and we can take it from there. And what I was saying earlier, again, we can go deep down and find old models of giving, including those who are still practiced today and who are evolving, and people adapt them from in different places. So whatever example I give is not something that just needs to be taken and say, oh, this is the one, and this is now in a picture, in a frame, and we're going to name it this. Just to understand that it's models and ways of doing things, and that people adapt them from wherever they are. One of the examples that I've, that are closer, I guess, to me, because right now I live in this fishing community, and I've described before, is that once a month, people go to fish every day, of course, but and when they come back, they sell the fish. It's actually the women's practice to be the sellers. But when they come to shore, once a month, everything that is caught and the day is designated goes to a community pot. And that community pot is what is used for as a foundation, or as for people in need, and it could be in times of crisis. It could be for individuals that needs certain things. But it's an old tradition, and people have always been doing it. What I realize, being in that community, is that there is no big deal about it. It's just things that people know of, and they do it because they know that that's part of the practice. But I've also observed things that even go deeper in that. There are people who are always sitting on the shore. Most of them, they're older people. The boats are always there, even when young people left and everything. There's always some people who come, who are almost guardian of the shore. They sit along, and somehow they always know, like the people who come when the small boat comes to shore and they bring down the fish. There's always a share first, before any transaction happens, before anything is sold or exchanged. A share that is taken and put down, and there is a gesture that goes with it. It is taken and thrown away a little further from the boat, and everybody knows that is a share of some of the people who are maybe elderly, who won't go anymore, but they came to get fish, and they will get fish. It doesn't matter. And also there are people who are mentally ill, for example, and people know that they have to have their share. It's not a question. It's not a conversation. There is nothing about it, and it just happens like that. And the women also, who are doing most of the time the selling, there are codes that goes with it, and all of this goes around around this community. And when they come together, when they also go and do the selling, of course there is always the pot of solidarity, the lending money to each other, etc. But there are also specific women who are almost guardian of the needs or the stories. People know where to go in the discretion, at night or something like that, and express certain issues, not for themselves, sometimes just for somebody else, that they know that something is going on and there is a need, and they know how to figure out how to support each other. So to me, when we look at it, we're just like, okay, yes, there's some traditional things, but there's also some very modern models that are born from it, including some of the young people who organize themselves for wrestling matches or competitions and stuff. And when you look at it from outside, of course, it looks like everything else that everyone else is doing, but there is a share, and it's understood to it, that goes to the community. I'll step back and give completely different example from the community that I live in, today. And this one is a group that works on making textile, and this is a very modern group in Mali, in Ségou, called Ndomo. And Ndomo is really a society, an education society inspired from old models, where young people come and learn how to do something with their hands. They actually make beautiful textile. Anybody who knows me knows that I'm a little crazy about textile and beautiful materials. So I go and look for it. But what I found when I went and so attracted by the beauty of this textile is the process to make it, where people have individual textile that they make, groups that they make, and it's, business. They sell it, they make money. You can make money individually, you can make money as groups of people, small group, bigger group. But then they have also a day in the month, or where it's called Jatigilado, where the work that is done that day belongs to the community. And they take the inspiration from migrants, people who are migrants. Generally, they leave the villages and they come into the city. Normally, they don't always have somewhere to stay, and they stay with, families. Sometimes it's not really families, extended family. But when they wake up and go to work, most of the time they just go and sell things in the street and so on. There is a share of money that they give to, generally it's to the women who make the cooking in the house. But that share is not just for cooking, it's also for helping people who are in need. So this textile group have adapted the traditional models that the migrants use, and say that, okay, there is a day, or there is a time where what we do, what we make, goes to the people that we the community that we live in. And I'll end by saying that even in the spirituality and in the belief system, some of the best way to give, I guess, or to stay in relation, I guess that's how I could put it, to stay in relationship with people, and particularly with people who have passed away. We're talking about people who are dead, is to give. The only way to be in relationship with the dead for them is to give, because and then you give to people you don't know, you give to people in need, but the purpose of that giving is for you to be channeling it to people who have passed away and that you love and that you are connected with. So to me, and I can go on and on, of course, in terms of examples and practice and belief systems, etc. But just to say that giving is about relationship building, really. It is less about what you give than the relationship that you build by giving. And it's not what you give. What you give is almost a symbol. It's the material in between, but it is beyond the material. Is behind that giving what you're looking for in terms of value, of course, I want to say self-worth and self-satisfaction, but it's also about giving into the future and understanding and believing that it's almost like planting seeds. You put it on the ground. It's almost something that is gone away, something that you lost, but in a way or another, it will grow again, it will grow back, and it will multiply, because what you give will grow back. And it doesn't matter, and you don't even know who will benefit from it. Of course, if you plant a tree, you don't know who's going to be under the shade, but you know it is important to do it for that reason. I'm going to stop here, but it's just, again, to me, the ways we give are multiple, and particularly I pay attention to women's ways of giving, because I've seen those practices, and how the connection works, and how even it is taught. How do you teach people to give, individuals to give? It starts from childhood, and it is from receiving that we learn how to give. And generally, the first givers in families are women, whether it's through, breastfeeding, through language, through play. It is people, the first way we receive most of the time, and that we learn how to give, is from women a lot of the time. So to me, it is important to look at that, and to look at how it affects and can influence the way we speak about giving. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kumba, for those rich examples, but also what it is rooted in. Maru, I see you nodding and smiling, and I wanna bring you in here, because there's so much resonance around Tukaful and the meaning of giving in North Africa. But I want to ask you specifically. I mean, this framing of giving is not one that's ordinarily seen in the dominant narratives, right? And so we've been pushing this, but what are some of the challenges in advancing these narratives? How are we as a field, or you personally, navigating this?
Halima, can you repeat the question, please? Do you want to
Sure.
talk about the challenges?
Yeah, so I'll sum up and say there's so much of resonance between what Kumba is saying and how giving is understood in North Africa, right? If you think about Tukaful and the spirit of solidarity and the collective welfare. And I want to ask, you've been working on advancing this alternative narrative giving for a long time, but we're constantly facing challenges, right? We're constantly marginal. We're still on the side. Becky and I were having a conversation not too long ago where he was saying, we're now part of the mainstream. And I was saying, no, we're still pushing from the side to be recognized as legitimate. And so I really want to ask you a little bit, what are some of those challenges and how are you navigating those?
You know, when I was listening to Kumba, can you hear me well? I have to raise my voice.
Yes, we can hear you.
When I was listening to Kumba, I realized that the challenges is also I don't want to sound like there is a conspiracy in this, but we have a challenge even in the narrative, because female giving, like, this is research, this is like a national representation of the Egyptian population, for example, female giving is higher than male giving. This is a fact. And when you look at what is said about Africans or Arabs or Muslims or whatever, people would not speak about the importance of the role played by women, as the fact is, it is. And it is very concrete. Even when we speak about waqf, which is a fundamental sustainable philanthropic model in our region, because it's sustainable, it means like you have it's like an endowment form of giving where you tie up the capital and only you spend from the investment that you do or the interest of the expenditure. So as long as the corpus or the capital is not touched, is waqf, is stayed the same, you keep sustaining spending on the causes that matter. And when you only tackle the idea of female funding, the oldest, let me to be very clear about it, even in Qarawiyyin in Morocco, the oldest Waqf educational institute started in Morocco, and it was the Qarawiyyin University at that point. And actually, when you think about it, just interesting. This is why I find this very interesting. Actually, it was founded by a lady called Fatima Al-Fihri through her significant Waqf fund. You're talking here about year 850. Like we exported these concepts to the world. The universities were civic endowment to advance education founded by females. And not because my mom's name is Fatma, but also Cairo University was founded by a generous Waqf. It was the largest Waqf to fund Cairo University, and it was also by a female, Princess Fatma was her name, Egypt as well. So so if you want me to talk about the challenge, the first challenge is, why aren't women in our part of the region appreciated? Where comes these images of the suppressive, submissive Arab or African women? Arab and African women are very strong, and they are givers, and they shape the nation. If you want me to speak about challenge as well, everything we do is being accredited to other people. Like we have to constantly prove that this is ours. You know, even when I even in the words around me now, I was thinking about for example, being Semitic. Our Arab language is Semitic, yet we are not identified as Semitics, for example. When people speak about anti-Semitics, you don't understand that Arabs are Semitic, for instance. So I think the challenges that philanthropy is facing in our part of the world really starts with a narrative, because giving is the idea behind the whole universe, giving birth, giving. And that's why in our parts of the world, despite the colonialism, despite so many harsh histories and things that we have gone through, philanthropy managed to keep our societies going. Nobody would sleep hungry, whether paid by zakat, money from the Muslims, or ushur, tithes by the Christians. This is part and parcel of the giving in Egypt. And our philanthropy is so overwhelmed by so many miseries around us, so that it's this takaful. People are constantly giving their best, so your neighbor is not hungry, so your friend is well off. Even sadaqah, the concept of sadaqah, even when you see someone well off, but they need money to regain the business, for example, even you could find poor people getting together because this person needs to regain the status. So speaking of challenges, they come to suppress the beauties that and the potential that our philanthropy has. And another challenge is also comes from modern states, from governments, because with authoritarian governments as well, you would find the government want to be even the sole provider of everything, including philanthropy. So instead of, for example, the Waqf as a concept, we had civic foundations that were independent from the government for centuries and centuries. This is when we had free education, the best hospital services, and this we're talking like even thousands of years ago. When I'm talking about Waqf University, I'm talking about Azhar University that is we're talking about thousands of years ago, much older than many countries around us now. And they were so fine, providing such fine services because they're funded by people. However, with the modern state and with authoritarian regimes, and sometimes even these were the result of imperialism and colonialism, you find that authoritarian regimes would want to provide even philanthropic services. So this is when they started confiscating the Waqf structures. The ministry, and this happened all over across Africa, in all North African parts, even in Syria, Lebanon, and also the other Asian parts, like in Palestine. Birzeit University in Palestine. She was the woman who funded the endowment of Birzeit University. And why this was funded was to fight British colonialism in Palestine. And you can see the challenges. All of these awqaf, the government confiscate all these awqaf, and now we lag behind. We have no transparency over the awqaf that used to support these institutions. They are government owned now because we have ministries managing awqaf now, and one minister overlooking all these thousands of waqf that used to be individually run. And this destructed this very rich system, and unfortunately we're losing it. We could have missed it, but now we are regaining, and I think that because of this kind of discussion, because of researchers, we're regaining our models back. We will try to make our best that we regain, what we missed, but this is part of our challenge. And you know what, like Birzeit University fighting the British colonialism. Princess Fatma in Egypt, when she started the Cairo University, it was also to fight British colonialism by local philanthropy. So this is the power of philanthropy, and it can be scary for some who want to control because it's freedom. It is about freedom.
Thank you so much, Marwa, and particularly for bringing up the issue of giving as civic resistance. I think that's such an important component that's almost always overlooked. But if we think of our community organizing systems, of our localized movements, of our civic movements on the continent, and we think about how giving shapes those, it's such an important component. Chris and Tendai, I want to bring you in here and talking about, how this is positioning. But before I do that, I want to recognize there's an interesting conversation in the chat going on around we want to be recognized by who, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. So please do hold those comments for the group discussion. But talking about the internal and external and the narratives, and Chris, you talked earlier about localization and decolonization, and we know the practice is just far from it. But can you talk about how these narratives, a little bit more, about why narratives are so important within this context of all of these terms that are being thrown about, but which aren't really necessarily appropriate to our context? Is it just semantics, or is there a deeper contradiction in play?
That's a very good question. I've been thinking, sort of ruminating on Audre Lorde's book, The Master's Tools, and the question about if the master's tools can dismantle the master's house during this conversation. And I think when it comes to narrative and framing and why this is so important, it is to some of the question that's going on in the chat. Who are we trying to influence? Why? To what end? Because, one version of this is ignore those guys in the global north and their, what they've done. To your point earlier, African philanthropy was not colonized, Africa was. I am concerned that going forward, African philanthropy may be colonized as the sort of younger generations move into a digital world which limits how people perceive culture rather than celebrates its diversity. I think there's this, you could ignore it and we could spend all of our time and efforts building, reinforcing the cultures of philanthropy and giving around us. And I think that would be a life well led. The overwhelming majority of giving on the planet is not from foundations, it is not from governments, it is from citizens. And the best research I've ever seen to that effect, which is old and self-admittedly undervalued the actual value of individual giving on the planet, put the dollar number at $4.6 trillion annually versus the total combined value of philanthropy and government being in the order of 400 billion. So you're talking about 1,000 times more, at least, in the sort of narrative and definitional frame that would call that the money that citizens were giving to civil society, not inclusive of the kinds of things that we've been talking about here today, that Kumba was talking about, for instance, in which case the number in terms of resilience, in terms of resistance, as thankfully has come up, would be much, much, much larger. So again, we could spend our time focusing on that. However, if one of our interests might be to influence the global narrative, then we will have to do some work in thinking about where our values are aligned globally, because I think the expressed values underpinning most of philanthropy globally are shared with African cultural, historical traditions and values. I believe that you can hear the words, the same words coming out of people when they talk about these things in Brussels or in New York or wherever. However, the organizational practice of philanthropy into large institutions has often led to the technology of philanthropy expressing or being sort of realized in terms that are less value aligned. So the values may be there, but then the actual practice of philanthropy doesn't necessarily embody those values in the global north when you talk about certain kinds of large institutions. Again, putting aside small individual giving. So if it was of interest to shift any of how the global philanthropic practice might better embody some of these values, then we have to find those shared narratives, work together on them. If there's an interest to influence how the funders who are global north funders, who may or may not be in their grant practice embodying values, are working to adopt, reflect, and enable civil society and civic action on terms that are more locally reflective, shall we say, then again, there's a lot of work to be done. But I think these are all things that we need to think about. I think regardless of which path or if it's both paths, either way, the work starts with a lot of what has happened in this partnership. We have to be doing this work to understand sort of how things are operating, why people value certain kinds of interaction and relationship and trust, etc. This is necessary as a step. Then come some of these other questions about sort of narrative, which narrative and who do you want to hear it?
Thank you, Chris. Is it an African narrative we're working for, or do we want to shift a global conversation on what philanthropy is so that different regions and different societies can see themselves in it? Tendai, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Thank you so much for the rich conversation so far. So I think maybe to flip it slightly, I think it's for us to say, what is the purpose of philanthropy for us in Africa? What place does philanthropy occupy? And then also, that will sort of go into the second objective to say, what then is the purpose of this discussion? So I think if you look at philanthropy in Africa, it's not an afterthought. When you look at philanthropy in other regions, philanthropy happens when somebody has become rich. All of a sudden, you're a billionaire, now you can give away some money. Then you register a 501c3, then you give away some money because you've done well, right? But for us, philanthropy is part of our everyday ecosystem. So if I was to take this from, say, a role development framework, to begin to say, philanthropy plays a huge part in everyday practices of production. Yeah, how we pull together assets, how we make sure that if we are in the season for or working on the land, no one is left behind because they do not have productive assets. So we deploy what we call here in Zimbabwe, Ilima, Nimbe, or Humwe, which is a collective pool whereby we come together and we do this. To service one goal, we want to enhance production within the community. So philanthropy for us then is not something we think of later, it's something we do on a day-to-day basis. Then in the event like we have now, in the Southern Africa part of Africa, we have a huge challenge around El Nino caused drought. My suspicion is that communities are going to be the first responders because we already have these concepts. In Shona, they have a concept called Zunde, in Isindebele, Isiphala, Senkos, which are all methods or mechanisms that are done at community level to make sure that no one goes without. So we store away for a rainy day, we keep grain for a rainy day, etc. So our philanthropy is organized around, number one, organizing production, organizing accumulation, and organizing welfare. So these are all the stages of livelihoods, if you want to think about it. So even in terms of commonly shared infrastructure, around our roads, our bridges, we again deploy philanthropic mechanisms in terms of making sure that we sort of were looking after our assets, our productive infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. So this is how we've sort of organized philanthropy, if you like, separate from what the global or dominant narratives look at it. Because dominant narratives are waiting for an occasion that there is a disaster in community X or in country X so they can send a check. But for us, we've understood it as part of our everyday lives. So I think it's an important and fundamental difference in how we frame this conversation. And when we talk with our northern counterparts, they always struggle with this because for them, philanthropy is something that you can measure quantitatively. How much money was given to community X? For us, philanthropy is mostly in kind. It's the giving of our time, the giving of our skills, of our assets, and the sharing of our productive assets. So I'm talking in raw context, it's our productive assets like our cattle to till the land, etc. And also I face the risk by what I've just said to begin to say, are we only romanticizing the past or we are romanticizing village life? How do these things that I've made reference to affect daily life, given the fact that Africa is one of the fastest urbanizing regions? So we feel that there is an organic link between what we learned or what we took from the village and what we're using in the urban context, which is very important because for any student of philanthropy jetting into Johannesburg, jetting into Harare, into Nairobi, you are not going to, if you look for signposts, you'll miss it because it's embedded again in our everyday lives. So if you were to go into the marketplace and begin to understand the levels of solidarity and the mutual aid networks within those places, how we bury each other, how we support each other's business, how we make sure that we help you to start your business, etc., all based on non-business frameworks that seek to earn an interest or whatever, but coming together and putting together resources and how we look after each other during funerals, even in urban areas, how we collect from our neighbors. All of it having been influenced by how the village is organized. So I think that's an important difference in us to say, for us, philanthropy has never been about the big checks that are signed occasionally, but it's about what we do on a day-to-day basis. And it's about obligations that we are wired with as we exist within Africa. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tendai. Some really important points. When you talked about organizing production, accumulation, and welfare, you didn't or it, you and. And there's this tendency to separate our philanthropy as though there's an immediate and then there's a long term. And our embedded giving almost in many spaces addresses both at the same time. And the common misconception we're always having is that, oh, you Africans give and you just give to people you know, and you just give to your neighbors and your friends and your family, and it's just for crisis response. But actually, there's a strategy, there's a method to the madness, right? It's about how do you address the immediate, how are you thinking about building the basis for long-term asset giving? And I think that's a really, really important conversation to be having. The other one is around how this work is not work, how giving is embedded. And I agree with you completely that it is not an afterthought here. But I also want to push to say there are other societies where it is also not an afterthought. If we think about some societies in South America, if we think about Malaysia, if we think about some societies in Asia, even if we look at indigenous societies in North America, there are some common grounding values where giving is embedded in everyday life, and the same kind of roots underlie it. And so I do want us to think a little bit more about whether this is just Africa specific or whether there's a bigger here to talk about. I want to then pick up on the next thing and ask others to come in. So we know that our giving practices are not static, and Tendai was talking about this right now, right? They evolve according to context. And what is seen as traditional also exists with adaptive practice. So what are some of these evolutions in African giving that we're seeing? Kumba, Marwa, others, I'd love to bring you in as well. We've heard a little bit from Tendai on this, but I'd love to bring others in too.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I just so fully agree with my co-panelists. And yes, to me, I'll push it a little further what Tendai was saying about our giving being embedded. My action and my pushback to just the general or modern global form of philanthropy is what if our way would be actually to make sure that people do not need philanthropy? What if we care for each other so that people do not have to hold their hands out and beg to get something? So to me, it brings us to the issue of justice, that sharing is no more just about charity, doing charity. It's about justice. It's about not just letting some people accumulate so much that, they can, feel, free or entitled to be building the philanthropy, but also not letting people being exploited and have their land destroyed and colonized and taken so much away from them that they be in this situation. So what if philanthropy was about to stop colonization first? It was about to stop exploitation and taking people. Because if you love people, if philanthropy is about the love of people, that's where it takes us. It has to take us far from the origin. And what do we do and how we treat people so that they don't become people in need, the poor that we manufacture so that we can help. So to me, that is another side of it that we have to look at. And yes, models, we can talk about rural community. I talked about, we talk about farmers, we talk about people who are fishing, etc. But we see some of these models and how people use them or do them, including migrant community. You go to Paris and you find people who moved, from Mali or Senegal, and they reproduce some of the same model. Of course, they're not fishing anymore, they're not farming anymore, but the principles of how do you make sure that people don't fall out on the side, that and how do you keep people dignity on? Because yes, it's one way to put money together and say, okay, somebody's poor, then we will help them, or somebody's in need. But the work really about being, I believe African philanthropy is how to preserve dignity, how do you give in a way that you do not have to keep people in a situation where they lose their own dignity, even in times of crisis. I give that example of people hiding to give, putting food or putting, bags of, cooked rice and stuff in cemeteries, and having codes where people go and get it so that nobody knows who gave and nobody knows who took, of keeping the dignity, because we know that we are responsible when not everybody is taken care of. It is our responsibility. It's not just charity or things that we are doing, but we are responsible for each other, and we are responsible into the future, because we understand the world as round and as turning. People can call it what they want, belief system, whatever. If my mother, feeds kids and friends and unknown people or strangers who are just passing by, with the belief system that her own children will be walking and traveling and going by, and believe that somehow what she gave to somebody here, somebody else will be giving that to her own children. So it can be considered as a belief system, but it actually works if people share the belief system. And that, when people move around and they're travelers, wherever they go, where people have that belief system, it works. So to me, we need to look at that. There are evolutions of it. People find always ways of keeping it and making it happen, and somehow it works.
Thank you, Kumba. That's one of the most beautiful ways I've heard reciprocity described within African philanthropy, because it almost becomes a bad word when people talk about reciprocity, and it starts being said, oh, well, that's not giving. But if we think about it beyond ourselves, and we think about it as a shared value system where we're all here in collective community, it takes on a different tone and a hue altogether. I want to touch on something, and just to emphasize the issues of dignity and justice as sitting as core of this, just don't get talked enough about. And so really, really appreciate you raising this. Chris, I talked a little bit about metrics. What are we measuring? And you alluded to this earlier in some of your conversation. We're so used to, and I remember many years ago on the African continent, we were trying to quantify the amount. We were trying to quantify in dollar terms what people gave in volunteer terms, in terms of time and in terms of skills and in terms of capacity. And the question wasn't being raised then, but it is being raised significantly now. Why is it that needs to be the case? Why do the metrics are a particular way, but do they need to be that way? And how do we shift those metrics so that we're starting to recognize how giving happens in so many different ways, and it's not just quantified on a dollar term?
I blame economists. I mean, I'm only partially joking. I think the sort of professionalization of philanthropy in the global North grant-making sense, and I think that extends to the development aid sector. And I think we need to be specific about who we're talking about when we say philanthropy. There are millions of people in the global North who integrate giving into their daily life as a part of their community resilience and social justice. We must respect that. That's part of philanthropy. When we start talking about the sort of over metricization, the sort of numbers fetish of the space, I think it's because you have a bunch of people who maybe in their desire to say they're doing a good job have tried to quantify it, right? They are often responsible to a founder who is no longer alive, and they've been entrusted, called as trustees or not, with being able to say they're doing a good job. How do you say you do a good job? The easiest way is counting the numbers and saying they're going up. Look, and even better, they're going up while costs are going down. This is a extremely capitalist approach to something that is not very capitalist. And for me, what has bothered me in this, as somebody who's lived and worked outside of the United States for most of my life in countries with increasingly authoritarian regimes, watching the challenges to civil society, in trying to quantify hours or dollars, you miss the point about everything we've been talking about here, the hard to count stuff. I think you, perhaps most importantly in a civil society sense, you miss the point about the dollar given or the hour given being representational of faith in community, in society, in a future, in a potential to be an owner of that future, an influencer of that future, and as a fundamental act of participation in an open society. This is inextricable from open society work. And I think that is something that I find to be somewhere between offensive and programmatically wrong in the metrics space as often applied by the large foundations who are super excited about it. But it's their money. Oh, you're muted, Halima.
Sorry about that. Thanks, Chris. So I want to broaden, as we're talking about the broader definition of philanthropy, and we're talking about matrix, but I want to move us onto the road forward conversation. So what do we do to change this? What's the road ahead asking of us? Chris, I'll start with you, and then I want to go to Ebrima and bring him in.
Sure. I mean, I think the road ahead to me is sort of working on two fronts. One, to continue the work that has begun in this partnership. There are a lot more stories. There are a lot more research. There's a lot more that could be done to gain a broader understanding of this space. I think the initial work is beautiful, and there's just more, right? There's a massive human instinct that is embodied in giving, and there's a lot of mapping and work to be done to go further on that. I think the other thing to really think about, and this comes back to some of the narrative questions earlier, is to think about to whom we're trying to communicate and to what end, and to not only tell the story. Tendai brought this up earlier, and sort of that the story has been told and told and told, but perhaps to really try to create the spaces in which we can go from the story into how we embody these stories in practice and institutionalize those stories, so that we're trying to align the value of the story with the practice that we want to see continuing in the world, be it in grassroots everyday giving, the support for the infrastructure that works to enable all of this, or on the more organized sort of big philanthropy side of the house. I think this gives us the evidence and a starting point to have very concrete organizations that look at policy and practice. And I hope that this is the beginning of some of that as well, so that we don't find ourselves only telling the stories again. Thanks,
Chris. Ebrima, can I bring you in? We've been doing this work for a long time. Many of us here on the call are can talk back to 15 years ago when we were still having these conversations. What's needed from us?
Well, first of all, let me just say how enlightening this conversation has been, right? I think everyone you listen to, you think, wow. So I've been saying that to myself all the way. Wow, this is great. Another, excellent point. So this is very good. For me, of course, the first thing is to continue this work, right? We need to just really, exactly what Chris was saying. I think we need to deepen the research. We need to extend it to cover a lot more spaces and a lot more cultures and a lot more places. and deepen the thinking as well, and the effort to interpret and not just go by maybe traditional canons of philanthropy or what has been going for philanthropy. Precisely, the whole thing is meant to challenge that. So we need to deepen the thinking, and also move from the stories and the thinking to reflecting on the institutional forms and of course practices and policies are one thing, but also just institutional forms and the Chris mentioned infrastructure of philanthropy. I think there's a need to look at the way, as I said this earlier on, just the legal systems in place, what they enable you to do and what they make difficult, So that's one thing. Secondly, so if we are talking about leaving nobody behind, I think this expression has been used. I can't remember who first used it, was the Tenbai or somebody else. This is where we are now. The SDGs. I was last week in a meeting in Addis Ababa, and it was all about what the world is trying to do to make sure that the performance in terms of achieving the SDGs is not just woefully low, right? Because as it is now, the targets are in many places not going to be met. So the point is, philanthropy definitely has a role to play in that respect. Coming from Africa, we can talk about philanthropy and practices, but our interest is in what? Our interest is in making life better for everyone. It's in transforming economies, societies, and conditions of living, enhancing, the justice. The point about dignity is fundamental. So in a sense, I think it's a way of making sure that what we are talking about here is giving, reciprocity, solidarity, philanthropy, making it speak to those issues in a much more deliberate way, complementing the efforts that, of course, governments are making, private sector is making, and So how do we get philanthropy to speak to that in a much more important way? And also, obviously, it means making philanthropy anticipatory. How do we not only enhance the transformative edge of philanthropy, but also make it much more capable in terms of its anticipatory powers? We know what is sort of emerging on the horizon. We know what the demographic challenge is likely to be. We know what we are seeing in urbanization, that this is going to continue. Everything is being reconsidered. What is the future of education? What is the future of work? What is the future of everything here? To what extent is philanthropy as it exists now in the African continent, indigenous forms in particular, are they anticipatory? How is it demonstrating its anticipatory capacity? At the village level, what people do sometimes at the end of the rainy season, to prevent bushfires from coming to, and running the risk of the village being burnt by bushfires, they would, clear around, well before the bushfires begin appearing anywhere, so that when they come, they would stop somewhere. It's a kind of anticipation. It's shorter, but it's a way of preparing themselves for dangers. People create digs around rivers to make sure that when the floods come, they wouldn't overrun them. So from that level, how far can that sort of anticipatory, process go to if we begin thinking about the future, about the number of young people who will be coming to the labor market, about what technology is already doing in our societies, and how can philanthropy engage those processes? And I think today we can still be talking about indigenous philanthropy, but the lines will be more and more difficult to draw between them and the modern forms. They are intertwined, and diaspora philanthropy and philanthropy from the cities or the rural areas, and so that's going to be all intermingled in a much more important way. And how do we now keep track of all those changes and borrowings from one to the other are happening, and move it in ways that make them work for us? I think that's what we are trying to do when you're talking about reimagining philanthropy, Pan-African philanthropy. We want to make sure that we don't leave things to chance. We can intervene where it is possible to intervene to make sure that these things work better for our societies and to help us in achieving the transformation objectives we want to achieve.
Thank you. Thank you, Ebrima. So I'm being reminded by Emmett that we're at time for opening this up, and this is such an interesting conversation. Tendai, Kumba, Marwa, I hope we can come back to you in closing remarks to think about how we're moving forward, but I really do want to open the floor up to everybody to share your thoughts, reflections, comments. There's a lot going on in the chat. I can't keep up with everything and also moderate, so you'll bear with me, but please raise your hand to comment, to reflect, but also for any questions you have to our panel here today. While we're waiting for others, Matt, I want to ask you if you have any reflections you want to share at this point.
Well, first, it's just been a great pleasure to be here this last hour and a half or so, because teaching is a gift and learning is a privilege. And for me, working on this project, it's been a lesson about the persistence and the tyranny of conceptual frameworks and the importance of trying and getting it wrong and fixing things. I think that, working on this project as a craftsperson who's really supporting what I hope is a project by and for Africans, learning like how my tools can get in the way sometimes. And I hope that we're able to continue the project. I'm looking forward to continuing to work with other folks about on making those tools better. So I suppose my reflection is mostly that it's fascinating as a craftsperson who works on technology to have this opportunity to think about how to really put into practice ideas that are easy to assent to, but harder to implement in a practical way.
Thank you, Matt, for sharing that. Dear Kumba, to your question, and I'm assuming this, but I'm pretty sure this will be the case, that the recording will be able to be shared, as will resources to the existing articles. I see two hands, Malak and Leila. Malak, can you go first? Malak, are you there? Can you unmute? Okay, so Malak is saying it's really interesting how women, especially in Egypt, actually play a key role in philanthropy and giving. My question is, how can young women contribute to that? Malak, we're not able to hear you, but I have read out your question. Mora, would you love to take that? After that, we'll go to Leila and to Tafadzwa. Marwa, hold on. Let me take Leila's question and then Tafadzwa, and then we can get responses and then go do a second round. Why do I see your hand as well?
Hello.
Leila, yes, go ahead.
First of all, I'm very honored to join today's seminar. It was very fruitful, as I would say. And given today's discussion, I have a question regarding designing policies and philanthropy. So how can we leverage philanthropy and how can we use it to challenge Orientalist notions and address the deeply rooted gender issues that women in the Middle Eastern societies face, and ensure that policies are not only effective, but they're also culturally sensitive and empowering?
Thank you, Leila. Tafadzwa?
Hi,
Okay,
everyone. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Okay.
Tefaso, we're having a real challenge
I'd
hearing you. It's
like
breaking up.
to thank the panelists and everyone for a very enriching discussion. And I'd also like to add that. Oh, okay, can you hear me now?
Tefaso, you're breaking up. Do you
Am
want
I
to try and
audible?
type into the chat? No, you're not. Can you try and type it into the chat? And while you're typing, I'll ask
Hello,
Wyroo
can
to
you hear
go
me?
ahead. We can hear you, but the sound is really bad. Wyroo, can you go ahead while somebody can please just ask Tefaso to type into the chat?
Yeah, thanks, Halima. This has really been great. Fantastic conversation and really some really fantastic insights. I have a comment and also just a question about just some considerations or a consideration that I've been having or a thought that I've been having. My comment would be that, how I don't know if it's a comment question. How do we acknowledge and bolster philanthropy in Africa without getting into the space that governments should be occupying? And I think about that because in my context from independence, there was this rallying call by the government to for communities to chip in and it was called Harambe and chip in towards their development. But then a couple 50 years later there's this point of we pay taxes, we pay taxes and people even most people in this context will pay taxes even if it's value added tax. So these taxes should actually be going into developing their citizens. So how do we balance and say, okay, yes, let's bolster philanthropy, let's ensure people are giving, but then also in Africa we've known people, and I saw it even in the chat, is that sometimes the community is giving to build hospitals, build schools, which is something that ideally the government should be doing. So that balance, ensuring that there's a balance between bolstering philanthropy, recognizing African philanthropy, but not letting the government off the hook for what they should be doing anyway. Then the second point is just around young people, and I think around millennials, Gen Z, Generation Alpha, and how whether they have the same values of giving and whether those same values of giving have been inculcated. I mean, and I'm talking specifically of these young people in Africa and whether they're thinking in the same way, they're giving in the same way, especially and just whether that's something that we need to think about. And because of this anticipatory philanthropy, in the next 30, 40, 50 years, will philanthropy look and feel in the same way? Like in my context, especially in urban areas, one of the things that came up was that there's so many young people who've just never even volunteered for anything. And so if you've never volunteered, for even, to just for anything, then, how would you even conceive giving back in kind or giving back or even just contributing towards a cause? So it's something that we need to, I think, start interrogating because we might be having some legacy feelings of how giving has happened in Africa. But then, the next generation are just like, if you don't pay me, I don't do it. And, I only give, if I feel like, I mean, I don't know. So it would be something that'd be interesting to explore. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those questions. I want to just pause on the questions. Marwa, can we start with you? I think the first two would be directed at you around women and around how do we challenge Orientalist narratives. Over to you.
Can you hear me? So,
yes.
So my next question was on women in Egypt and how can they play a key role in philanthropy and giving. My answer is they are. young female Egyptians are playing a role in giving, and it shows like from female giving. Maybe the question is how they play a more strategic role nowadays, as Kumba was saying.
Marwa, you're fading out. If you can just come a bit closer and maybe repeat the last part.
So I was, is this that? So
Not really. If you take video off, might it help? Thanks, everyone. Marwa is traveling, and so her connection is not that great. So thanks for bearing with us.
Is this better?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, so the question that Malak was saying about the Egyptian young girls' contribution to philanthropy, I believe I think the question is, as Kumba was discussing about our role in strategic philanthropy, how female role can be more strategic. And I think answer both questions together, because then Layla's question was about the policies behind it.
Marwa, you're still fading out, unfortunately.
I don't know what. So is this better? Nami,
Go ahead.
is this better now?
Yes, a little bit.
A little bit better. Okay, and I think for young Egyptians, there is a lot, especially females. They need to, knowing now about the narrative of philanthropy and how empowering the role of female philanthropists throughout the history of Egypt, and I'm sure all parts of Africa, this is empowering enough that young Egyptians take a lead in strategic philanthropy. And this starts with what is really making a difference in the long term, not only charity, but how giving, we need to be responsible in our giving, like how our giving makes a difference. And I think it's very important that we first have to reclaim our narrative, and there must be, because both are, like Layla and Malak, they are both students. They are actually my students at the American University in Cairo. And I really encourage them to play a leading role now that they are familiar with the importance of the narrative for African philanthropy. They need to start with doing research on our narrative and seeing how the philanthropy can continue to be more strategic and more institutional. And empowering. So, for example, when you come to think about mechanism like zakat, for example, zakat, one of the legislations of zakat is that if you have 100 pounds, for example, you don't give 100 people, because one of the legislations is empower through your giving. So you can get the money, the capital, make a bigger capital and give it to one family and make this family independent of your philanthropy in the future. This is in us. When you look at in Waqf, in the narrative, you see that for Waqf is about knowledge. Giving knowledge is one of your sustainable giving. Educating people, making a project that keeps sustainable, that is sustainable for others, so that it keeps them standing on their feet. So start with claiming the narrative, doing the research, and invest in innovation, in innovating philanthropy that it fits with our current modern world, like technology and innovation and social enterprises. And this brings me to the second question of Layla, because as a student of public policy, you guys learn the importance of policy policies, no matter how many people we try to help, thousands, hundreds of thousands, however, with policies, changing policies to make them more encouraging to civil society, influences the work of millions and billions of people. And this is what you should invest your studies in when you with policy as policymakers influence how the government should create an encouraging environment for philanthropy, how we can work, because for example now if NGOs in Egypt try to work with NGOs in Africa or in Europe, this is so complicated because in the policy perspective of our governments, we need to take approvals, we need to report what we're doing, we need to influence policymakers to see civil society organization with the lens that they are partners to government, not that governments should fear them. So these are
Thank you, Marwa.
Thank you.
I'm sorry to cut you short. In my head, I've been thinking I have until the end of the hour, and Emma has just reminded me we're 15 minutes over, but this has been such an engaging conversation. So two things. One is that we certainly need a follow-up conversation on this, that much is clear. Two is I want to read out Tafatwa's question and also ask if Alia and Adole and Feruza could type in their questions, and we'll address that in the closing remarks if everybody will bear with us. But before we get to that, there's a question around the philanthropy of the future and around giving and not replicating government space. Does anybody want to take that?
I'm happy to speak here to this. To me, to start with, philanthropy is and should be first about fighting injustices. So to me, it is important that what we do and how we do it is in that channel. So sometimes we have to fight government, and sometimes I believe that the philanthropies, particularly the big groups in the global north, role is to fight and stop their government from creating the situation that would make us need, some of their help in the first place. So it is about going deep. As much as we talk here about the values and the models of African philanthropy, I think if there is anything that could be learned from this to the I don't know if we're gonna call it modern or classical model of philanthropies. The learning point to me, I'm going back to the issues of dignity, of fighting the creation of this situation where people now need to be, are in it. That's why for me with TrustAfrica, our work around, fighting illicit financial flow for me is about philanthropy, because it's to go deep. People who are fighting for reparation. Maybe people won't put these into it, but to me, it is, you have to go to the core and expand what we are doing, so that we can make real change. And I heard somebody was talking about what about young people, and earlier the risk of colonization of African philanthropy now. It is true that today the model that is upheld is to become first of all to become rich enough that you become this big philanthropist, because it's what is glamorized and shown. And of course, you have a lot of young people, young Africans who think that way too. Let me get and accumulate as much so I can become the good the good guy or something like that. And I think it is, you were asking about the ways forward. That is our challenge, to make sure that we tell the stories of what philanthropy is, so that it becomes the norm. It becomes what people and young people strive for and look for. Because the whole fight about narrative is that when something is designed and talked in a certain way, everybody moves towards that and think that's what that needs to happen. It is our job to show that no, we are not going to wait until we get there to give or to become the person that is important. No, we are responsible for each other from the beginning, and that is the value that we need to share and to show. Thank you.
Thanks. So there's more questions than we can take. There is one around, given our diversity, how do we influence policy? Tendai, I wonder if you could take a quick minute to answer that, and then I'm going to try and wrap up with Chris and Ebrima.
Quick minute. You said, well, how do we advance?
It was around, given that we have such diversity in African philanthropy, how do we look at advancing policy in this regard?
Yeah, I think, see, there are many expressions and manifestations of African philanthropy. So at times I try not to reduce it to say fits in this space. I actually look at it as a paradigm of how we look at Africanness, philanthropy being who we are. But be that as it may, philanthropy is also a program of action, an agenda that we have. So there are two things. Philanthropy itself as a sector is under threat from policies. Then philanthropy itself is also an enabler of more just and equitable policies by the kind of resources it can marshal, the goodwill it can marshal towards making sure that we enhance or we build a concerted movement around certain issues to make sure that we have equitable agriculture, we deal with the flows of finances out of the continent, etc. But I'm more interested in philanthropy being under threat itself, because there looks like there's a consensus against African agency, yeah, on the part of our governments, on the part even of the international community. So I think it's the awakening and the realization that the things we're talking about here may sound benign, but they're actually the most potent force in Africa when we mobilize and we begin to realize our agency to say $2 mobilized from 2 million people can actually do so much more. So I don't think there is a force that is actually currently holding power that is interested in understanding how that can come about. So there's that issue. And there are many policies that have come up. One of them around the movement of money. The second one being about the registration of philanthropic platforms and institutions. The third one being about certain causes that we are being sort of restricted from supporting. These are minority causes. This could be due with what we call the hardcore governance issues. So I think when we're looking at policy, we're looking at it from that perspective. On the one hand, how it directly affects the growth of the sector, and also how philanthropy itself, if released from all these inhibitions, can actually contribute towards sharpening the advocacy movement on the continent.
Thank you, Tendai. Chris and Ebrima, I'm going to come to you last. Thank you, everyone, for really bearing with us. And for me, we're hopelessly over time. But the fact that so many of you are still here means that this is a really engaging conversation. And we'll try and figure out collectively how to address some of the questions that have not been answered, but also how to take some of these conversations further. Chris, can I go over to you first and then Ebrima?
I would only say that I appreciate the conversation. I think there have been a lot of great questions and a lot of fantastic points raised, and I am very excited to see where we all go together.
Thank you, Chris. Ebrima, last words over to you.
Yeah, also just to thank everyone for the excellent contributions, and thank you for moderating this panel so well. So it's been very good. And just one point of substance, I think it came in Tendai's intervention. There are off limits for philanthropy, institutional philanthropy at this. There are no-go areas, it seems. If you begin talking about accountability, governance, corruption, and so on, you may run into trouble as a philanthropic institution, or if you support certain movements. And there's a lot of work to do along those, in that regard. So that when we also talk about African philanthropy and giving on the continent, I think we should be very clear about the potentially subversive dimension of it, in some respects as well. And the fact that some strands of philanthropy, some philanthropic work is welcome. You can have the same government encouraging certain practices of philanthropy and be very nervous when it comes to other practices of philanthropy or actors being supported by philanthropy, because it's easily branded as engineered by foreign institutions and so on. So even though we know that it's rooted on the continent, so there's a lot on this that we should, I think, be attentive to, and not just also having a uniform discourse about it. I think that would not help. There are challenges that philanthropy has to learn to address in a much more important way on the continent. But really, it's been insightful. It's been, I've learned a lot, and I enjoyed the conversation immensely. And really, thanks once again to our friends of GivingTuesday, and thanks to you guys leading it, and thanks to all the panelists and to all the participants. And the conversation must continue, as the research must continue.
Thank you, everyone. This has been such an insightful conversation. Like Eprima, I've been like, oh, wow, yeah, we need to think about this more. We need to think about that more. So really, just thank you for all of the contributions, the questions, the comments that have been happening in the chat. Thank you, dear Kumba, for your generous offer. And we will definitely find ways to deepen and broaden these conversations, but also to deepen and broaden the work. Thanks for bearing with us. Have a wonderful evening, everybody. Bye.
Did we take the picture that Maro wanted?
Oh, no.
Thank you, Halima. You were absolutely fantastic. Thank you.
Let's do the picture.
Thank you, Halima. You were amazing.
Thank you, everybody.
So how we
Yeah,
pose
thank
for the
you.
picture?
Okay.
Maura, I see you fixing your hair.
Can someone who's more tech
Yeah.
savvy do a screenshot?
I can do it.
Yeah.
If we can get to.
And
if
can we
get
take our
one.
recording? I think we can stop our recording. Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah, and save the chat. Some messages on the chat,
Yeah.
please save them and